The heat of the afternoon lay heavily across the grassland, pressing down on every sound and movement, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Light shimmered in pale waves above the dry soil, and insects drifted lazily through the air, their soft hum barely noticeable beneath the stillness. In a narrow stretch of tall grass, flattened slightly by unseen weight, a lone lion lay stretched on her side, her tawny coat dulled by dust and sweat. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven patterns, each breath seeming to cost her more than the last. One foreleg rested at an unnatural angle, marked faintly with dried blood and clotted dirt. Her tail lay motionless beside her body, and only the faint twitch of her ears hinted that life still moved beneath her fur. A wildlife worker approached slowly from the edge of the clearing, his boots brushing softly against brittle stems. He had noticed her from a distance, at first mistaking her still form for a shadow cast by uneven ground. But something in the way she failed to shift or lift her head had unsettled him. Now, as he drew closer, he shortened his stride, lowering his shoulders and steadying his breath. Years in the field had taught him that sudden movements could turn fear into panic, and panic into collapse. He paused every few steps, letting his presence settle into the environment like another passing breeze. The lion's eyes opened halfway, dull and clouded with fatigue, following his slow progress without lifting her head. A low, fragile sound escaped her throat, not a roar, but a soft vibration that barely carried beyond her own body. He knelt several meters away, resting one hand on the ground to steady himself. From this distance the signs became clearer. The shallow cuts along her flank, the subtle tremor in her muscles, the way her breathing stuttered when a fly landed near her nose. Dehydration had tightened her skin against her ribs, and her tongue briefly flicked out, dry and pale, before retreating again. She tried once to shift her weight, pushing weakly with her hind legs, but the effort faded quickly, leaving her exactly where she had been. "It's okay," he murmured, barely louder than the rustling grass, his voice kept low and steady, meant more to anchor himself than to command her attention. The surrounding plain continued its quiet routines. A distant herd moved slowly along the horizon, their silhouettes softened by heat haze. Birds circled high above, occasionally dropping to investigate before drifting away again. The wind passed through the grass in slow waves, brushing against the lion's coat and lifting strands of fur from her side. She blinked once, then again, each movement deliberate and heavy, as if even her eyelids were burdened by exhaustion. The worker remained where he was, observing, listening, letting the moment unfold without interference. In this shared stillness, under a sky slowly leaning toward evening, two lives paused together, bound briefly by fragile breath and the quiet promise that help had finally arrived. As the afternoon light softened slightly, thinning from harsh white to a muted gold, the space between the man and the lion seemed to narrow without either of them moving. The heat still lingered, but it no longer pressed as heavily as before. It settled instead into the grass and soil, clinging to fur and skin alike. From where he remained crouched, the wildlife worker studied her with careful, unhurried attention, allowing his eyes to move slowly across her body, reading each detail as if it were a quiet language. The injury on her foreleg was more visible now. The fur there was darker, matted where blood had once flowed more freely, now dried into thin crusts along shallow cuts. The limb lay stiff against the earth, and when she attempted to bend it, the motion stopped halfway, blocked by pain and weakness. A faint tremor traveled through her shoulder each time she tried. Her breathing remained shallow, her sides lifting only slightly before falling again, uneven and strained. Between breaths, her mouth opened just enough to reveal a dry tongue, and a thin string of saliva clung briefly before disappearing into the dust. Flies gathered near her eyes and wounds, and though she flicked her ears to chase them away, the movements were slow and incomplete. Each small effort seemed measured, rationed carefully, as if her body were conserving what little strength remained. Once she attempted to lift her head higher, pushing against the ground with her uninjured leg. For a moment her neck straightened, her gaze sharpening slightly. Then the effort drained away, and her head lowered again, resting against the flattened grass with a quiet, weary exhale. The man did not move closer. He noticed the tightness of her skin, the hollowed curve behind her ribs, the dullness in her eyes that spoke of thirst more than fear. He understood that rushing forward, even with good intentions, could turn her fragile balance into collapse. Instead he stayed where he was, keeping his posture open and relaxed, his breathing slow and steady. His presence was meant to be something she could grow accustomed to, not something she needed to resist. He rested both palms lightly on the ground, grounding himself in the rhythm of the landscape. Every few moments he shifted his weight slightly, careful not to produce sudden sounds. When she glanced toward him, he met her gaze briefly, then softened it, lowering his eyes again. "Easy now," he whispered once, his voice barely shaping the air, more like a thought than a command. Around them, life continued without urgency. Grasshoppers leapt from stem to stem. A distant bird called once, then fell silent. The wind carried faint scents of dry leaves and warm earth. The lion's chest rose and fell in slow persistence, each breath an act of endurance rather than alarm. She was not fighting wildly, not attempting to flee. She was simply holding on, conserving herself in quiet determination. The man recognized this stillness for what it was. It was not surrender. It was patience born of necessity. And so he matched it with his own, remaining beside her in silence, offering nothing but time, calm, and the steady promise that she was no longer alone in the waiting. The air shifted subtly as additional footsteps approached from beyond the tall grass, their rhythm careful and deliberate, shaped by the same restraint that guided the first responder. The sounds were soft, almost absorbed by the earth before they could fully form. Still, the lion sensed the change. Her ears lifted slightly, rotating toward the unfamiliar movement. Her breathing grew a fraction quicker, shallow ribs rising and falling with faint urgency. One eye opened wider, revealing a darker, more alert focus beneath the haze of exhaustion. Two more wildlife workers emerged slowly into view, stopping several meters behind their colleague. They remained standing at first, then gradually lowered themselves to the ground, mirroring his posture. No one spoke immediately. Their presence was introduced gently, like new shadows joining the afternoon light. The lion's body tensed, not in preparation for attack, but in guarded awareness. Her muscles tightened just enough to signal caution. She did not bare her teeth. She did not growl. Instead, she held still, watching, listening, measuring every small movement. One of the workers reached into his pack with exaggerated slowness, pausing halfway when her head lifted slightly in response. He waited until her gaze softened again before continuing. The zipper opened with barely a sound. A water container was placed carefully on the ground, far from her reach, its position chosen more for reassurance than immediate use. Another worker shifted closer by a single step, then stopped, letting the distance remain wide and respectful. "It's all right, girl," the first man murmured quietly, his voice steady and low, carried gently across the grass. The words were not meant to instruct her. They were offered as a tone, a rhythm she could grow familiar with. She blinked once, then again, her lashes brushing dust from her eyes. A soft breath escaped her nostrils, warmer than the air around her. Her tail moved slightly, dragging a faint line in the soil. She adjusted her weight, wincing almost imperceptibly as the injured leg protested. Then she settled again, choosing stillness over struggle. Her gaze shifted from one face to another, lingering briefly on each. There was no challenge in her eyes, only wary attention and deep fatigue. Instinct told her to remain alert. Her body told her she could not afford fear. The team responded by slowing even further. Every gesture became smaller. Every movement was softened. One worker knelt and placed both hands on his knees, showing empty palms. Another leaned forward slightly, lowering his profile. Their breathing synchronized unconsciously, rising and falling in calm, steady patterns. The space between them and the lion became less about distance and more about shared quiet. Gradually her breathing eased. The shallow hitch in her chest smoothed into a more regular rhythm. She rested her chin fully against the grass, no longer holding it tensely above the ground. A fly settled near her eye, and this time she did not bother to chase it away. Trust for her was not a feeling. It was a calculation made moment by moment, measured in the absence of threat. In that narrow space between instinct and exhaustion, something delicate began to take shape. Not ownership. Not control. Simply recognition. A wounded animal allowing unfamiliar beings to remain near. And humans responding not with dominance but with patience. Under the slowly dimming sky, surrounded by whispering grass and fading heat, wild strength and human care met quietly, balanced on nothing more than breath, restraint, and the fragile willingness to remain gentle. As daylight thinned into evening, the team's movements grew even more deliberate, shaped by the growing awareness that time no longer moved generously. The lioness remained where she had been, her body pressed into the flattened grass, surrounded now by soft pools of lantern light and careful shadows. Medical equipment had been placed nearby, arranged neatly on cloth laid over the soil. Nothing was rushed. Every action unfolded slowly as if the night itself demanded patience. When the veterinarian finally approached close enough to examine her abdomen, her hands hovered briefly before making contact, giving the lioness time to register the presence. The touch was light, respectful, barely more than a whisper through fur. Beneath that gentle pressure, something shifted. A subtle firmness. A faint movement. Then another. The veterinarian paused, her breath catching quietly as realization settled in. "She's pregnant," she whispered. The words did not travel far, but they changed everything. The team exchanged brief, careful glances. Until that moment, every sign had pointed only to injury and dehydration. Now, a deeper story revealed itself. The hollowed frame, the extreme exhaustion, the fierce economy of her movements, it had not been only about survival. It had been about carrying life forward while her own strength slowly drained away. The lioness seemed unaware of the significance of this discovery. She remained focused on breathing, on maintaining her fragile balance between wakefulness and collapse. Yet as night fully settled, her restlessness increased. Her muscles tightened and released in slow waves. Her breathing shifted, growing heavier, more deliberate. Occasionally, a low, strained sound escaped her throat, quickly fading back into silence. The team adjusted quietly. A soft barrier of equipment and blankets was arranged to provide shelter from wind and cold. Lights were dimmed further. Voices dropped to whispers. One worker remained seated nearby throughout the night, never turning his back, never allowing the space to feel abandoned. "It's all right," he murmured once, barely audible. "You're safe." Her body began to work in earnest sometime after midnight. Subtle contractions rippled through her abdomen, visible beneath the thin layer of fur. She pressed her paws into the earth, claws extending briefly, then relaxing. Sweat darkened the dust along her neck and shoulders. Still she did not panic. She did not thrash. She endured in silence, guided by instinct older than fear. Hours passed in quiet vigilance. Then just before dawn, as the horizon lightened to a pale gray, the first cub emerged, small and slick, barely visible against the grass. The lioness shifted weakly, gathering the tiny form closer with trembling precision. A second followed not long after, then a third, each arrival greeted not with sound, but with careful, exhausted attention. She lowered her head, touching them gently with her nose, breathing warm air over their fragile bodies. Her eyes, once dulled by pain, now held a faint, steady focus. Despite torn muscles, dehydration, and wounds, she had carried life to its beginning. Around her, the team remained silent. No one spoke. They watched as understanding settled slowly into their hearts. Strength, they realized, had not looked like roaring defiance or dramatic resistance. It had looked like quiet endurance in tall grass. It had looked like a wounded mother choosing again and again to stay alive long enough to give her cubs a chance to breathe under the open sky. Weeks passed in a rhythm shaped by recovery and quiet dedication. Under careful monitoring, the lioness gradually reclaimed her strength, each day marked by small, meaningful changes. Her wounds closed slowly, the torn skin knitting itself back together beneath regrowing fur. The swelling in her injured leg eased, allowing her to place weight on it without flinching. Water and nourishment restored depth to her breathing and warmth to her eyes. Through it all, her cubs remained close, pressed against her side, learning the first patterns of movement and rest from her steady presence. She learned to rise again without hesitation. At first, standing required effort. Her muscles trembled as she lifted herself from the ground, pausing halfway before committing fully. The cubs watched intently, tiny bodies wobbling as they tried to imitate her. When she walked, her steps were measured and deliberate, testing balance and strength with every placement. Gradually the stiffness faded. Her stride lengthened. Her posture lifted. The powerful curve of her shoulders returned, no longer shaped by pain but by confidence. The team reduced their presence slowly, allowing distance to grow in careful stages. They observed from farther away each day, intervening less, trusting more. The lioness responded by reclaiming her instincts. She began to scan the horizon again. Her ears stayed alert to distant sounds. Her tail moved with renewed purpose. She groomed her cubs methodically, guiding them with gentle nudges and low, steady rumbles when they strayed too far. On the morning of her release, the plain stretched wide beneath a pale blue sky. Clouds drifted lazily overhead, and the grass moved in long, shimmering waves. The transport gate opened without sound, and the lioness stepped forward slowly, testing the open ground. For a moment she stood still, breathing deeply, drawing in the familiar sense of earth, wind, and distant herds. Then she walked. Each step carried quiet certainty. Her injured leg moved in rhythm with the others, no longer lagging behind. The cubs followed close, stumbling at first, then finding their balance. One paused to investigate a tuft of grass. Another bumped gently into her flank. She waited without impatience, allowing them to gather themselves before continuing. The rescuers remained several meters back, forming a loose line of stillness. No cameras were raised. No voices broke the air. They watched not as owners of a success, but as witnesses to a return. Their work had been to support, to protect, to step aside at the right moment. At the edge of the open plains, she stopped once more. She turned her head slightly, scanning the landscape that would now shape her cubs' lives. Wind lifted the fur along her spine. Sunlight traced soft gold along her shoulders. With a final, quiet adjustment of her stance, she guided her cubs forward again. They moved together into the tall grass, their forms slowly dissolving into light and motion. Long after they disappeared, the team remained where they were, listening to the distant calls of birds and the whisper of wind through reeds. In the fading warmth of morning, surrounded by open sky and endless horizon, they carried with them the enduring image of a mother who had walked through pain, patience, and uncertainty, and emerged whole, leaving behind nothing but quiet strength and the soft promise of life continuing. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.